This is MDK. Welcome to DF Retro. Today we're revisiting this classic action game in all its forms. We'll start with a look at the game itself and the capabilities of its engine, followed by a look at its various incarnations. Let's get started. Founded in 1993, there was a time when Shiny Entertainment stood as one of the finest game developers on the planet. A studio known for creating titles which exuded creativity and style unlike anything else out there. This small studio, founded by David Perry, was made up of industry veterans with experience creating games such as Cool Spot and Disney's Aladdin for the Sega Genesis. Its first project as an independent studio, however, was Earthworm Jim, a beautifully animated, wholly bizarre platform action game which looked unlike anything else on the market. Following the completion of these two games, a number of key people, including Douglas TenNapel, left the company to form the Neverhood, a studio whose first game was the beautiful claymation adventure also known as the Neverhood. Despite the loss in staff, Shiny did manage to keep its momentum going as it started to work on its next game, a PC title simply known as MDK. MDK is the brainchild of Nick Brody, a talented designer from Livingston, Scotland, who played a significant role in the creation of Earthworm Jim 1 and 2. And it's something of an anomaly in the PC space. It is, in many ways, a PC game created like a console game. From its core game design to the way in which its engine works, MDK stands apart. At its core, MDK is a platforming action game in 3D. On the surface, each stage consists of 4 distinct building blocks: the aerial drop into the stage itself, the challenge rooms which make up the majority of the experience, the connecting hallways filled with mini-games of sorts, and the slipstream bonus sequence. Each room or area consists of a series of increasingly complex challenges. Take this introductory sequence for instance. Snipe enemies out of the tower, destroy this barrier using the grenade received for sniping enemies out of the tower, grab a mortar, lob it into the building and open it up in the process, take out this enemy spawning machine, distract your foes, and then blow them all away before continuing. What makes this room-by-room approach so interesting stems from just how different each one can be. The game keeps you on your toes, and it's never really certain just what kind of bizarre challenge you'll face next. Each area is then connected by a tunnel, which could be thought of as a loading tunnel, but in reality these sections also present interesting gameplay opportunities. In one stage you use the tunnel itself as a high-speed luge. In another you surf down a metallic slope fighting enemies to a James Bond-esque soundtrack while collecting dog bones. Whew, if you couldn't tell, MDK doesn't take itself seriously. It's this interplay between lightheartedness and more foreboding themes that helps define the game. From dropping onto the set of a fake cartoon show where you can topple its wood-paneled walls, to the combat scene scored by an unnerving air raid siren. It's all very strange, yet strangely cohesive. The game presents a beautiful cyberpunk aesthetic across the mine crawlers that you're invading, with foreboding skylines and otherworld structures that continue to look great today. But all of this insanity relies heavily on its core technology. MDK delivers a level of performance and visual quality that you may not have expected from a game in 1997. Massive levels with hordes of enemies, neat visual effects, and unique gameplay opportunities await you within. MDK is a game that was written from the ground up using a highly optimized custom codebase designed specifically for PCs of the day. Each level was carefully designed and modified in order to run smoothly on the minimum spec PC, which according to the game's requirements is a Pentium 90 MHz, though earlier documentation actually shows it as coming in at Pentium 60 MHz. The objective here, though, was to reach a stable 30 frames per second on every PC capable of running the game. Now, when you first launch the game, in fact, MDK actually confirms the presence of a CPU with floating point unit capabilities. This ultimately serves as a 486 lockout of sorts. If you lack a Pentium-class CPU, the game simply cannot be launched. While there are certainly limits on what could be achieved here, the visual language works well within these constraints. MDK utilizes large 512 by 512 palletized texture maps with regularly cycling palettes, but the game actually relies heavily on empty space to build its atmosphere and world. Structures often consist of flat-shaded polygons or surfaces which are entirely black. The combination of textured segments and darkened regions creates a unique contrast that contributes to its strange atmosphere. While the majority of the game world is rendered entirely using polygons, the main character, Kurt Hectic, is actually a two-dimensional asset. It's certainly an interesting approach here, but it works pretty well, at least at the default 640 by 480 resolution. Of course, this was the 90s, so you know that there are multiple ways to play the game. The original European version of the game actually shipped with support for MS-DOS and Windows 95. The North American CD, however, which is the one that I own, actually includes support for Direct3D as well. And later patches were also released with native support for 3dfx Glide, Rendition Redline, and Power SGL. This, of course, presented some problems. This game was designed very specifically for its software rendering capabilities, and the standards were not yet in place at the time, which meant that 3D accelerator results could be a little bit hit or miss. If your card didn't support 8-bit palletized textures, for instance, visual quality might be limited. The real issue lies in textures. The aforementioned 512 by 512 texture maps created for the software renderer were simply too large for graphics cards in 1997. The original Direct3D version included on the disc and the 3dfx Glide release were actually limited to just 256 by 256 texture maps, which of course had a negative impact on the presentation. In addition, bilinear filtering was relatively new at the time and sought after by most people, but the technique didn't actually work particularly well with the game's gritty artwork. As a result, 3D card users were stuck with blurry, lower resolution textures slathered all across the world. Thankfully, the Direct3D version was actually patched again, adding support for full 512 by 512 textures, while offering users the option to disable texture filtering in addition to various other settings. With the right settings then, it's actually possible to pretty much match the software version. This flyby sequence actually does a good job of showcasing the loss in texture resolution on the 3dfx Voodoo. You can really tell that a lot of detail is missing in that version. So here's how the game looks in its original DOS incarnation, and of course the Windows 95 version. They're basically the same, right? Now if we compare this to the 3dfx version, you'll notice that the lower resolution textures stick out immensely. In Direct3D mode with large textures enabled, however, things certainly look a lot more accurate here. Which may leave you wondering, what is the best way to play MDK then? Well, strangely enough, using a mix of 3dfx Voodoo emulation along with the Direct3D patch. If you own the original disc, you'll want to download some of these files from the internet. If you have the GOG version, which actually lacks support for the MS-DOS version natively, you should already have what you need. That said, the GOG version comes with N-Glide, and in this case I actually recommend downloading DG Voodoo to emulate a 3dfx card. Now, DG Voodoo allows you to customize settings in such a way as to push beyond the limits of a real 3dfx card. This is the setting that allows you to select the largest texture size available if you select the Direct3D version, and you can of course disable texture filtering as well. Yeah, that sounds a little bit strange, but it's true. You want to use Voodoo emulation to run the Direct3D version of MDK. That will give you the best results, which is actually how I've been showcasing the game throughout most of this video, since it's possible to force higher resolutions than the standard 640 by 480. You can then use programs such as XPadder or Pinnacle Game Profiler to create custom profiles enabling you to play MDK on a gamepad of your choice. Amazingly, the game still holds up. The bold visual design remains as strange today as it was in 1997, and the action comes fast and heavy. You don't even really need to aim while running around in the third person, it's more about positioning and jumping. It feels more like Doom, for instance, than say Quake. Plus, the game features an amazing sniper view here, which allows players to zoom in much further than in any other game prior, which is actually an impressive element to its technology as the game didn't use fogging or level of detail. Each stage was designed so that you could see all the way across the stage, no matter where you were. Now, as impressive as the PC version was, there was actually an attempt to bring it to another platform, and that is MDK for the Sony PlayStation. Now this is a version with some history. Shiny Entertainment simply didn't have the manpower to port its game to the PlayStation, and it needed to secure a third party to handle it. That studio would be Neversoft, the very same Neversoft that would go on to build Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Now it actually started from the ruins of a game known as Big Guns, a game which actually never made it to completion and put Neversoft through very difficult times. While the port was still in development then, Neversoft actually pitched an idea for a port of MDK to the PlayStation using this technology. Shiny was impressed with its work and the team was given the green light. MDK for the PlayStation is an interesting beast. Much like Lobotomy's work in porting Quake and Duke Nukem 3D to the Sega Saturn, MDK has been completely rebuilt for the PlayStation. With its new engine, the game does manage to feel surprisingly faithful, but it's clear that a lot of little changes were made throughout. Textures, for instance, are now much lower resolution on PlayStation, and completely different in fact. They do tend to feature more colors, however, as the developers were able to utilize unique palettes for each palletized texture, rather than cycling a shared palette like the PC game does, which can lead to some minor improvements, but I think I still prefer the gritty look of the PC version. The PlayStation version is also missing some of the finer texture details, such as the wounds on this boss's face incurred by sniping him. Kurt's sprite also takes a hit with fewer frames of animation, and issues when transitioning between jumping and standing. This just doesn't look quite right to me. Explosions are no longer made from polygons now, but instead more traditional particles, and they look pretty okay. The loading tunnels also actually require more loading than before, with actual pauses in the gameplay. On PC, much of the game could be kept resident in memory to avoid hitches during these sections, but that's not the case on PlayStation, as you might have expected. The end sequence after finishing off a boss has also been eliminated on PlayStation, with a stark cut to a loading screen before the bonus stage. One of the biggest challenges faced by Neversoft, I'd imagine, is dealing with wide open spaces. PlayStation doesn't work well with large, flat, textured surfaces due to the limitations of affine texturing, which is what causes much of the warping. To work around this, developers often subdivided terrain geometry into increasingly complex meshes, but when the playfield is this large, it becomes rather expensive. On PlayStation, you simply needed to use more triangles to create large flat surfaces than you would on, say, the PC or Nintendo 64. The development team did find a happy medium here, and it doesn't look that bad, but it does come with a huge penalty: frame rate. MDK does not run well on the PlayStation. Each of the larger areas where triangle count becomes a bottleneck tends to run well under 30 frames per second, leading to a real sense of inconsistency. It makes performing actions that much more difficult. It's far too variable for its own good. Now, the PC version was capped at 30 frames per second, but on PlayStation the frame rate is actually unlocked, so you sometimes get scenes like this with much higher frame rates, scenes which give us a taste of what could have been on the PC without the cap. But then on the flip side, you get scenes more like this, where the frame rate just kinda tanks. While it wouldn't solve all of these performance drops, I do feel that it would have been smart to cap the frame rate at 30 FPS in order to avoid these wild fluctuations. You've probably also noticed how the PlayStation version makes changes to certain visual elements. This area, using completely blacked out geometry on the PC, uses actual textures on PlayStation and winds up looking somewhat less stable as a result. I did find this change interesting though. On PC, this mirrored floor stage looks pretty good, and on PlayStation we get different colored panels instead. Both look really cool, I think, and it's neat to see the difference. On the flip side, there is one benefit to the PlayStation version: Red Book audio. The brilliant Tommy Tallarico soundtrack is somewhat compromised on the PC, sounding like this. But on PlayStation, with its Red Book audio tracks, it sounds more like this. Quite the difference, huh? Ultimately, MDK on the PlayStation is an interesting port from an academic standpoint, much like Quake on the Sega Saturn. It's a game where its design runs contrary to what the PlayStation was designed to do best. The fact that Neversoft was able to translate the entirety of the experience to such a different platform and a new engine definitely deserves serious credit here. If the performance issues were worked out and the sprite work improved then, this could have been a great way to play MDK today. Looking at the game as a whole though, I think the takeaway here is that MDK is still a brilliant and unique game that holds up surprisingly well in modern times. If you've never played it, I actually still recommend giving it a shot. It's one of the few early 3D games from that era that still holds up really well, and its unique vision shines through as brightly as ever. And you can get a fully playable version over on Good Old Games, which is pretty cool. Following the release of MDK then, Nick Brudi and a number of others actually left Shiny to form Planet Moon Studios, where they developed the brilliant Giants Citizen Kabuto, another classic game which I may have to take a look at in the future. MDK then was passed along to BioWare, that's right, the RPG development house, which developed an excellent sequel in the form of MDK 2. Now that game exceeds the scope of this episode, but perhaps in the future we can revisit that as well. Oh, and the MDK IP is now up for sale, so hopefully someone can put this train back on the rails. And as for Shiny, well, its next project was actually Wild 9 for the PlayStation, an interesting platformer based on torture. Seriously. Features another great soundtrack and some lovely visuals, which made for a rather interesting gameplay experience, even if it wasn't super well received by the press at the time. Shiny also released RC Stunt Copter a year later on the PlayStation, before finishing up the much hyped Messiah, which was released on the PC in the year 2000. But with that, we've reached the end of another episode. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support DF Retro, be sure to give us a like and subscribe, and of course share this video with your friends, it really helps us out. So until next time, stay retro. Next week we're off to the Eurogamer Expo, so that means there probably won't be a new episode. But do be sure to let me know on Twitter which other games you guys would like to see in a future episode so I can continue building my list.